Homeless boy shouts, "Don't eat." Billionaire freezes upon learning the shocking truth. All eyes immediately turned to the source of the outburst, a homeless boy. Dressed in tattered clothes, his face smudged with dirt. No one understood what was happening. But the man seated at the center table froze, his spoon hovering just inches from his mouth. Jonathan Pierce, a renowned billionaire, wasn't the kind of man easily rattled. At 68, he had endured countless ruthless business deals, building a vast financial empire from nothing. And yet, in this moment, an unshakable unease settled over him as he locked eyes with the strange boy. Across from him, Isabella, his young and stunning wife, sat equally stunned. But unlike the others, her gaze wasn't filled with mere shock for a fleeting second. There was tension in her expression. Le Chateau was an elite establishment, its golden lighting casting a soft glow over tailored suits and the rich aroma of aged wine. No one paid attention to kids like Leo, a street-smart boy who lurked in the city's shadows, unnoticed by the privileged. But today, he had stepped out from the darkness, defying all risks to stop something from happening. What no one in the restaurant knew was that this very moment would change their lives forever. Le Chateau had always been a favored destination for the elite. Nestled in the heart of the city, it was renowned for its exquisite menu, impeccable service, and an ambiance dripping with sophistication. Tailored suits, dazzling evening gowns, the soft murmur of laughter mingling with the aroma of fine wine. It was a portrait of pure opulence. At the central table, billionaire Jonathan Pierce dined with his young wife, Isabella. He was no longer the ambitious young man he once had been. But power and wealth still made him the focal point of every gaze in the restaurant. His custom-made suit, the glint of a Rolex on his wrist, and the composed demeanor of a man who had spent his life dominating the business world ensured that he remained the center of attention. Yet today, there was a weariness in his sharp eyes, a hint of fatigue as he scanned the menu. Isabella, in contrast, radiated energy. She was young, stunning, with voluminous waves of hair and porcelain-perfect skin. Her red silk dress hugged her curves in all the right places. And the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone was proof of the extravagant life she led. But even as she sat across from Jonathan, her eyes weren't on him. Her fingers glided over the screen of her phone, her brows furrowing slightly as if something far more important than lunch with her husband occupied her mind. Jonathan noticed. He wasn't a fool. He knew when a woman smiled but her eyes remained dull. When her hand rested on his but held no warmth. Isabella had everything: money, status, a life most could only dream of, yet she still seemed unsatisfied. He exhaled, setting the menu down, and spoke in a measured tone. "You're distracted again." Isabella immediately looked up, flashing a perfect smile, one crafted through years of posing for cameras and attending high society galas. "Not at all. I'm right here." She placed her hand lightly over his, her eyes shimmering with practiced affection. But something felt off. There was an artificiality in the moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, but Jonathan had lived long enough to recognize when someone was hiding something. Beyond the restaurant's barriers, another pair of eyes watched them intently. Leo, the familiar street kid of the neighborhood, stood in the shadows, silently observing the wealthy patrons indulging in meals he could only dream of tasting. But tonight, he wasn't just watching out of hunger. A strange sense of unease stirred within him, though he couldn't yet understand why. Leo was used to standing on the outskirts of this world. Lavish meals, people draped in expensive clothes, carefree laughter, none of it belonged to him. But today, as he watched from beyond the barrier, something felt off. He didn't know why, but his eyes kept being drawn to Jonathan Pierce and Isabella's table. The billionaire looked weary, holding his spoon but not eating, while his wife's behavior seemed strange. She wasn't paying attention to her husband, her eyes kept flicking to her phone, her expression impatient. Then, suddenly, Leo saw her hand slip into her purse and pull out a small vial. He squinted, observing closely. She wasn't taking medicine, she wasn't applying perfume. Instead, with practiced ease, she twisted the cap open, and in one swift, almost imperceptible motion, a clear liquid dripped into Jonathan's soup. Leo froze. For a second, he wondered if he had imagined it. But no, he had seen it clearly. Isabella stirred the soup casually as if nothing had happened. then smiled sweetly at her husband. No one in the restaurant noticed anything unusual. Except Leo. He swallowed hard, his heart pounding. What was that liquid? A supplement? Or something else? A chill ran down his spine as he recalled the detective movies he had once watched through the glass of an electronics store. Could it be poison? But this was an upscale restaurant. Isabella was an elegant woman. Why would she do such a thing? The thought made Leo hesitate. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe no one would believe a street kid like him anyway. Yet, as Jonathan lifted the spoon to his lips, a sudden wave of panic surged through Leo. He couldn't just stand there. If that really was poison, the man would die right before his eyes. He felt as if he had only a second to decide. And then, before he could think twice, Leo bolted toward the barrier and shouted at the top of his lungs. "Don't eat that." The restaurant, once filled with laughter and the clinking of fine glassware, suddenly froze. All eyes snapped toward Leo, a homeless boy, dressed in tattered clothes, his face smudged with dirt, standing just outside the barrier with sheer panic in his eyes. He had just shouted inside one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. A place where kids like him weren't even allowed near. At the central table, Jonathan Pierce went rigid, his spoon, hovering just inches from his lips, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from sheer shock. A street kid had just screamed at him not to eat his food. Why? Across from him, Isabella spun around sharply. Her usually composed and graceful face paled for a fraction of a second. In her sharp brown eyes, there was a fleeting glimpse of something, panic. It was so brief that most wouldn't have caught it. But Leo did. "What did you just say?" Isabella's voice was cold, like the edge of a knife. Leo swallowed hard. His body instinctively wanted to step back. But he knew he couldn't retreat now. He had spoken up, and that meant he had to see this through. "I saw you put something in his soup." His voice wavered slightly, but it was loud enough for everyone to hear. A ripple of shock spread across the restaurant. Guests exchanged whispers, forks and knives clinking against plates as some people stopped eating altogether. An older woman covered her mouth, eyes wide. A middle-aged man in an Armani suit furrowed his brows, clearly struggling to believe what he had just heard. Jonathan blinked, shifting his gaze from the boy to Isabella. The silence between them lasted only seconds, but it was enough to thicken the air in the restaurant. "Isabella." Jonathan's voice was slow, but there was an unmistakable sharpness to it. "What is this boy talking about?" Isabella stiffened, but she recovered quickly. In an instant, the brief flicker of fear vanished, replaced by outrage, forced and theatrical. "This is ridiculous. A filthy homeless brat dares to accuse me? Who let him in here?" Her voice was sharp, laced with indignation, as if she had just been gravely insulted. But there was one thing Isabella hadn't accounted for. The first moment of panic she had shown was something she could never take back. Jonathan hadn't looked away from her. His eyes, which had seen through countless liars in the business world, now studied his wife as if she were a stranger. Then, he turned to the boy. "Leo." His voice was steady. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Leo clenched his fists, looking directly at Jonathan. He knew this was his only chance. If he didn't make himself crystal clear now, this man could die. She took a small vial from her purse. "I saw her open it. Pour a clear liquid into your soup. And stir it in." He took a deep breath, then added firmly, "If you don't believe me, smell the soup." The restaurant plunged into a deathly silence. Conversations were swallowed whole by the collective shock of everyone present. No one could believe that, in a place as refined as this, such a dark accusation had been uttered. Jonathan didn't react immediately. He simply stared at the bowl of soup in front of him, as if it had suddenly transformed into something foreign. His hand, the same hand that had once signed billion-dollar contracts with unwavering certainty, now trembled ever so slightly. Isabella was the first to break the silence. "This is absurd." She let out a laugh, but there was nothing natural about it. "Jonathan, are you seriously going to believe a homeless kid over your own wife?" Jonathan slowly lifted his gaze, and his eyes, once clouded with uncertainty, now sharpened. "I haven't said that I believe him, but I also haven't said that I don't." His voice was calm, dangerously so. For the first time, a chill ran down Isabella's spine. "Are you doubting me?" she shot back, her expression shifting to one of feigned hurt. "Do you really think I would put something in your soup? After everything we've been through together?" Jonathan tilted his head slightly, studying the woman before him as though he were seeing her for the first time. Every word she spoke was calculated, precise, but there was one thing she couldn't hide: fear. "I don't doubt anything," he said evenly, "but if you've done nothing wrong, why are you so nervous?" Isabella went rigid. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then, she let out another forced laugh. "Nervous? Oh, please, Jonathan." She rolled her eyes. "I'm just irritated that some filthy kid is ruining our lunch. Do you really think a street rat like him is more trustworthy than your own wife?" The weight of every gaze in the restaurant bore down on them. People whispered. Some even pulled out their phones to record. No matter how much Isabella tried to mask it, she couldn't ignore the crushing pressure of all those watching eyes. Leo didn't back down. He clenched his fists, inhaled deeply, and looked Jonathan straight in the eye. "You don't have to believe me," he said clearly, "but if you don't, then check for yourself. Call someone to test the soup. If there's nothing in it, I'll leave right now and never come back." Jonathan studied the boy, his gaze devoid of condescension or skepticism, only the careful deliberation of a man who had seen too much in his lifetime. He knew this was a pivotal moment. "All right," he nodded, "I'll check." The moment the words left his mouth, Isabella shot to her feet. Her chair scraped harshly against the marble floor, the sound slicing through the silence. "Enough, Jonathan. Don't let this child make a fool out of you." Her voice cracked with desperation. "Are you really going to let a homeless nobody humiliate your wife in front of all these people?" Jonathan calmly set his spoon down on the table. His gaze no longer wavered. At that moment, he already had his answer. "Then you won't mind if we check, will you?" Isabella froze. The tension in the restaurant was razor sharp. Jonathan stared at Isabella, waiting for her answer. She could keep pretending, or she could break right here, in front of everyone. Isabella let out a dry, hollow laugh, but this time, it wasn't soft or charming, it was strained, distorted. "Are you serious, Jonathan?" she said, still trying to hold onto a semblance of calm. But the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. Jonathan didn't reply. He only watched her, as if seeing a stranger sitting before him. A waiter hesitantly stepped forward, eyes darting between them. "Mr. Pierce, would you like us to call someone to test the soup?" That was the moment Isabella lost control. "Enough," she screamed, slamming her hand against the table. "This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You actually believe a homeless brat? A filthy, ragged street kid?" The entire restaurant gasped in unison. This was not the reaction of an innocent woman. A poised, high society lady, one who had always maintained her pristine image, was now unraveling. Shouting like a cornered animal. Leo stood his ground. His posture was firm, his gaze unwavering. "You're afraid," he said evenly. "If you did nothing wrong, why are you acting like this?" Isabella whipped her head toward Jonathan, grasping for one last chance. "Jonathan, you can't let some street rat destroy us. We've been together for so long. Do you really think I would do this to you?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression ice cold. "I think so." Isabella froze. 3 simple words, yet they cut straight through her like a knife. "We'll find out the truth right now," Jonathan said, turning to the waiter. "Call the police." The restaurant erupted. Guests whispered in hushed voices. Some pulled out their phones to record, while others simply sat motionless, glued to the spectacle unfolding before them. Isabella's face went pale. She looked around desperately, searching for a way out. "No, you can't do this to me," she shrieked, her voice breaking with fury. "Jonathan, this is a misunderstanding. You can't destroy everything over some street kid's word." But it was too late. The sound of sirens pierced through the air, and the entire restaurant held its breath. The piercing wail of police sirens shattered the tense silence in the luxurious restaurant. Every curious, eager, and shocked gaze remained locked on Jonathan Pierce's table. Isabella was frantic. She shot to her feet, clutching her designer handbag as if it could somehow shield her from the impending storm. Her eyes darted around, like a cornered animal searching for an escape. "Jonathan, you can't do this to me," she shrieked, desperation bleeding into her voice. "You really trust some homeless kid over your own wife?" Jonathan remained unmoved. His composure was unshaken, but his eyes were like cold steel. "I don't need to trust anyone, Isabella. I just need the truth." And the truth was standing right in front of him. 2 police officers strode in. One, tall and commanding in his crisp uniform, rested a hand on his belt as he surveyed the room before stepping toward Jonathan's table. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his voice calm but authoritative. A waiter quickly interjected, his tone tense. "Mr. Pierce suspects something is wrong with his soup. A boy claimed that Mrs. Isabella put something in it." The officer's brow furrowed as he turned to Jonathan. "Would you like us to have it tested?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "Do whatever you need to do." The moment the officer signaled for the restaurant staff to take the soup for analysis, Isabella truly panicked. She turned to Jonathan, and for the first time that evening, all pretense vanished. "You're really doing this to me?" she whispered, her eyes reddening. But Jonathan remained silent. The officers exchanged glances, their focus shifting to Isabella. "Do you have anything to say, ma'am?" For a moment, Isabella seemed ready to continue her performance as the wrongfully accused wife. Her lips pressed together, her hands clenched so tightly they turned white. But then, she made a mistake. Her eyes flicked to the bowl of soup, just for a fraction of a second. And Jonathan saw it. That single glance was all he needed. The truth was undeniable now. Jonathan inhaled deeply, then turned to the officer and said, in a voice calm and steady, "Arrest her." The entire restaurant held its breath. Isabella's face drained of color, and she instinctively took a step back as if preparing to run. But the officers were faster. "Mrs. Isabella Pierce, you are under arrest for the suspected attempted poisoning of your husband. We advise you to cooperate." A pair of handcuffs glinted under the restaurant's golden lights, cold, unfeeling, inevitable. Isabella thrashed, struggling against them, her voice shrill with desperation. "No, I didn't do anything. This is a mistake. Jonathan, please, you have to believe me." But this time, no one did. Isabella's screams faded as the police escorted her out of the restaurant, leaving behind a stunned, deafening silence. The elite guests, who had just been indulging in their extravagant meals, now sat frozen, watching as the woman who was once admired, envied, and untouchable was led away in handcuffs. Jonathan Pierce, a man who had built an empire on power and control, remained motionless. He had narrowly escaped death. But what hurt more was knowing that the person who had tried to kill him was the very woman he had trusted with his life. Among all the eyes following the shocking scene, only one person stood still, Leo. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction. He only knew that he had done the right thing. If he hadn't spoken up, this man might not have survived. And more than that, he realized something important. Sometimes, the truth just needs someone brave enough to reveal it. Jonathan turned his gaze to the homeless boy who had saved his life. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice calm yet firm. "Sit down, Leo." The boy hesitated, glancing around, but then, slowly, he pulled out a chair and sat at the very table where, just moments ago, an attempted murder had nearly taken place. Jonathan studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "You saved my life today. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to return the favor." Leo's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean?" For the first time that day, Jonathan smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I want to give you a chance at something different. A home, a better life." Leo froze, his throat tightening. He had never expected anything in return. He had only done what he knew was right. But now, in front of him, was a door he had never dared to dream of. A chance at a future beyond the streets. Outside the restaurant, the sun shone brightly against the endless blue sky, as if signaling a new beginning. Today wasn't just a story of betrayal and greed. It was a story of courage, of a homeless boy who dared to speak the truth, and of a powerful man who learned that sometimes the person who changes your life is the one you never even noticed before. Today, Leo didn't just save a life. He changed his own.